Beginning 2 decades before the Second World War, German Catholic philosopher Dietrich von Hildebrand waged an intellectual war against the rising Nazi ideology. To this, Franz von Papen, the Nazi ambassador to Austria, grumbled, "That damned Hildebrand is the greatest obstacle for National Socialism in Austria. No one causes more harm." John Henry Crosby on Dietrich von Hildebrand's memoir, My Battle Against Hitler, now. My name is Todd Warner, and this is the Evangelization and Culture Podcast from Word on Fire. John Henry Crosby is the president and founder of the Hildebrand Project, which advances the legacy of Dietrich von Hildebrand and the tradition of Christian personalism. Having pursued a career in violin performance, John Henry has a special interest in the role of beauty in human flourishing. He is a trustee of the Wethersfield Institute, the Knights of Columbus Charitable Fund, and a visiting fellow at Franciscan University of Steubenville. He is a graduate of Franciscan University of Steubenville, where he received his BA and MA in philosophy. He and his wife, Robin, live in Steubenville, Ohio, with their 4 children. John Henry Crosby, welcome.
Todd, it's great to be with you.
Segment 1. Meet Dietrich von Hildebrand. Raised in a loving home by parents who were nominal Protestants devoted to art more than faith, the young Dietrich von Hildebrand revealed a deeper sense of faith at a very young age. At the age of 5, he contested his parents' notion that Christ was not truly the Son of God. And at the age of 14, he rebutted his sister's insistence on moral relativism and his father's claim that Dietrich was too young to truly understand. "Your argument is clearly very weak," Dietrich fired back at his father, "if you have nothing but my age as evidence against me." As has been written in the foreword of von Hildebrand's memoir, My Battle Against Hitler, quote, "Part of the fascination we experience with Dietrich von Hildebrand's life comes from the degree to which he remained immune to the siren song of the great ideologies of his time. Just as he showed a striking independence from the milieu of his upbringing, so he showed an unusual independence from the currents of the age," close quote. So, John Henry, who was Dietrich von Hildebrand?
Well, I'm going to hedge a little bit because I know our show here is a chance to answer that question in a more robust way. But just in brief, Dietrich von Hildebrand was a German and later American philosopher, born in a German family in Florence to an artistic father, a great and renowned sculptor and architect, raised in an extraordinary home, and then, as I said, a philosopher, and then a great foe of the Nazis, and then worth noting also a convert, which plays an important role in his life, and and ultimately the author of many important books. And that's how I found my way into this work. Was the need to translate the riches of this man's thought. And I'm just delighted here to have a chance to unpack with you the different aspects of his life and thought in our time together.
I like to laugh, and for those of you listening out there, that I would say to John Henry that I get to start this podcast with the hardest question, which is tell me everything. So thank you, John Henry, for giving such a great and succinct answer that's going to kind of open us up to the rest of the podcast. I in my opening remarks for this segment, I did comment on how the family, his parents were nominal Protestants devoted to art more than faith. And as you've just mentioned, raised in Florence, his father being a celebrated artist, a sculptor, and so on. There was a real affinity for and affection for beauty in his home, and sort of this sense of goodness and truth that is embedded in that beauty. What role, notwithstanding kind of where religion was in his life or was not in his life in his early childhood, what role did art play, and how did that form some of Dietrich von Hildebrand's consciousness, if you will?
Well, it's a very good question, and it's important to get it right because I think some people have the impression that the kind of artistic environment that he grew up in was left behind later in life, particularly after his conversion. But I think the best way of putting it is that art, and a very noble conception of art, was in a way it was the religion of the family. Uh, and it had similar functions. It was high, it was noble, it was dignified. It expressed what was best about humanity, and so it was not a kind of an aestheticist environment, of refinement and superciliousness. It was a very deep, nourishing relationship to beauty that young von Hildebrand had in this family that he grew up in. And as a result, rather than being left behind in his later Christian conversion, beauty was fundamentally the path, and remained kind of like a permanent point of reference in his Christianity later on. And so, just to kind of preview it, if I may, the path to the conversion there were many stops along the way. Um, it's worth noting that, since you mentioned in your introduction sort of uh, the the early sort of independence of Van Hildebrand. Another interesting story was how, when his sister, one of his older sisters, took him to the cathedral in Milan as a kind of artistic outing. The young Van Hildebrand, as he approached the various side chapels, instinctively felt that he ought to genuflect. And this was a foreign gesture in this family because, again, there was no Christian religion. I mean, they were nominal Protestants, but there was no deep Christian faith. But Van Hildebrand thought that to go into these side chapels in the Duomo, or the Cathedral of Milan, was not a an adequate response to what he felt in this environment, and it was this sacred beauty that he was beginning to experience. So that's sort of one example of how even the early Hildebrand found this sort of purely artistic approach to uh, sacred themes insufficient. And then, as I said, there were sort of various developments along the way. One of his sisters actually converted to Catholicism before he did, and in fact, she invited him to her first communion in the catacombs in Rome, and it made a very profound impression on him. And she said to him, apparently at the time, she sensed that his heart was being pulled in the direction of the faith, and she said, grace only knocks once. You need to act now while you're having this draw. um, but it was, perhaps the central impulse for his conversion, was another one of his philosophy teachers, the philosopher Max Scheler, who was himself a Catholic at the time, and unfortunately later abandoned the faith. But Shaler said to Van Hildebrand one day, in their many conversations, he said, the Catholic Church is the true church because she produces saints. And he wrote for his friend Van Hildebrand a somewhat famous sketch in one of his works on the character or the figure of St. Francis of Assisi. And it captures St. Francis, uh, particularly under the aspect of the extraordinary beauty and radiance of his sanctity, the icon of Christ, that St. Francis was. And I think that that captures in a sort of potent way the way in which Van Hildebrand's conversion was mediated through beauty. It was the beauty of the saints. It was the beauty of the supernatural virtues. It was the beauty of the God man, of Christ himself. And so ultimately, rather than, beauty being a kind of like a weak foreshadowing of his later Christian faith, it became the gateway. And it remained with him throughout the rest of his life. And beauty as a kind of quasi sacramental reality is one of the core pillars of Van Hildebrand's thought as a thinker.
It's so interesting because I think we think of the modern kind of transcendentals of truth, goodness, and beauty, and I think one of the main notions, especially in a world that has become so deaf, if you will, or blind to the eternal or to God, is that in many respects what shocks people to their senses and like you said, serves as the gateway um, to God. Oftentimes, is beauty, is to stand. Just with your mouth agape in the Sistine Chapel, or to be looking at some masterpiece of art in a particular chapel or at the Louvre or elsewhere, that to sort of surrender yourself to the notion that something is truly and objectively beautiful opens you to the notion of that therein lies goodness, and where there is goodness there is truth, and where there is truth there is a truth origin in the sense of God. It's so interesting because when you read the memoirs, my battle against Hitler, that you and your father translated and edited, um, it's extraordinary how much you do encounter an old soul in the young person that is Dietrich von Hildebrand. So his time before the crucifix, his mother, I think it was his mother who was peering in the room, and there he was, effectively almost prostrate before the crucifix, like you said, a nominally Christian family, which I think, if I'm not mistaken, moved her to tears. So there's these profound depths, as you've described, that seems to be rooted in an appreciation for beauty, but it doesn't just stop there. There's something much, much deeper that would lead a little boy to genuflect in a chapel when he has no other reason to do so than to sense the eternal and the mystical. So it's extraordinary the way you've just described this. You mentioned Max Shaler, and I want to move the next step into Hildebrand's budding interest in philosophy. So Hildebrand was born in 1889, which is interestingly also the year that Adolf Hitler was born. He attends in 1906 the University of Munich in Germany, and quickly became enamored with the thought and work of philosopher Edmund Husserl and, as you mentioned, Max Shaler. Could you say, and I go again, not trying to give you really big questions up front, but just could you unpack a little bit who were Husserl and Shaler, and maybe say a word or two about the philosophical schools of phenomenology and personalism. What was it in them that drew Hildebrand's enthusiasm? Could you unpack that a little bit?
Yes, just that. Sure. So
We have
so
4 hours. No.
Oh, yeah, right, right. Well, so those, yeah, those are important questions. So maybe I'll back up on this question of Husserl and Shaler and Hildebrand's budding interest in philosophy by saying that already as a
Yeah.
young boy, um, I guess you would say in his late teens, with his tutors in Florence, he'd never attended a traditional school until he went to the university. He was entirely educated by tutors, and the the those tutors, one of those tutors introduced him to the dialogues of Plato. And that's really where his philosophical um, interest and passion were awoken in a whole new way. It was an introduction into a whole new world uh, of serious probing inquiry into the truth of things. And he was particularly moved by the figure of Socrates, this figure who would give his life in pursuit of the truth. And so I mention that in part because it's interesting to know where people's inspirations lie, and this interest and
Right.
love for Plato was lifelong. I mean, it was continue to read and be nourished by the Platonic dialogues through his entire life. But the other reason it's worth noting is that Socrates is a kind of witness to truth, an
Mm.
embodiment of the love of truth, and in so many ways that is what Von Hildebrand became, in his life. If you think of
Yeah.
the willingness to take the risks that he made in the fight against Nazism, I mean, this was this kind of Socratic readiness to make sacrifices for the truth, and also to pursue the truth in such a way as to help others to find it too. So you think of the cave, the allegory of the cave,
Mm.
and how once liberated, the person goes back to try to bring out those who were captive with him. So that's the spirit in which Von Hildebrand discovered philosophy, and he never lost this kind of deeply existential relationship to philosophy that he had at the beginning. Now, when he went to the university, he fell in with first a group of philosophers in Munich, and through them discovered the work of Husserl. But Husserl was important at the time for these because this is also the sort of the early Husserl, as he's sometimes referred to. Um, this is an important moment because philosophy at the time was was under the spell, you might say, of a kind of neo-Kantianism. And what that, to sort
Mm.
of boil that down for our listeners here, what that really meant was that there was a sense among philosophers that one couldn't break through to reality. That knowledge is just the knowledge of the structures of the mind, and
Mm.
so it's kind of locked into a sort of an imminent cycle, and this had a suffocating effect on philosophy, as you can imagine. If most of us begin with some basic assumption that, well, we really can know something about the world, and to be told by our philosophers that, well, we're really just knowing things about how we know the world,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's a very sort of demoralizing sort of place to be. And when Husserl emerged on the scene with a book called Logical Investigations, the central sort of accomplishment, and the accomplishment that was sort of recognized by especially these young students who came to study with him, was that he was returning to a kind of realism. He had there was a famous
Mm,
slogan, "Back to things themselves," which was
mm,
associated with this early Husserl, and this was an exciting and an inviting moment, to be a student of philosophy, to sort of overcome Kantianism, and to come into contact with the world in some fundamental way. And so the phenomenology that Hildebrand always associated himself with was so-called realist phenomenology. There were later phases of it, and there are many debates about, what in fact came after realist phenomenology. But in any case, those early students of Husserl were enthused by this return to realism, and this idea that we can do that our philosophizing is the investigation of the essences of things, and not just the
mm.
just not just sort of the things as they are perceived. Now, Shaler comes into the mix because Shaler was also a phenomenologist practicing in this spirit of realist phenomenology. But from Shaler, Van Hildebrand derived his personalism. And
Okay.
so personalism, in the sense of Shaler and others, is this idea of a philosophy that begins with a particularly sort of heightened and elevated sense of the dignity and the uniqueness and the irreplaceability of persons.
Mm.
And so you might say, in some sense, that personalism begins not with being, but with the person. Um, but I don't want to go down that path too much because that requires so many clarifications. Because, of course, for the personalist, the person is being in a particularly full sense of the term, right? It's not sort of like
Yeah, yeah,
subjectivity over here and sort of real being over there. No, no. In reality, for the
yeah.
personalist, being in a particularly rich and full sense is the being of persons. But Van Hildebrand was deeply shaped by these two sort of, let's just say, related impulses in philosophy: the radical realism and the extraordinary sense for the mystery and uniqueness of the person. Now, it's worth noting that Hildebrand himself never called himself a personalist. He would sometimes use
Okay.
that term of others. He would speak about the personalism of Jacques Maritain or the personalism of Shaler. But we his students have found it extraordinarily fruitful to think of him as a personalist and to read him alongside other great personalists. The other maybe key person, without getting too far ahead of ourselves, is Karol Wojtyla, John Paul II.
Mm.
And there's a
Yep.
whole story to be told there about how the students of von Hildebrand and the students of John Paul II met each other in the early years of the John Paul pontificate, and sort of what a kind of sense of mutual discovery
Wow. Wow.
this was for them. So I so, so I'll leave it there. I mean, you can probe me more if you'd like on any of this, but
Yeah, it's
this is sort of an attempt to be succinct about phenomenology for Van Hildebrand and personalism for Van Hildebrand and what that all meant at this moment of his studies. And of course, we can talk about how that develops in his various works. But I think that gives our listeners at least a sense of the encounters that he had under these teachers. And again, this is the same Shaler who also played a role in Van Hildebrand's conversion to Catholicism.
It's interesting because, I like to laugh, John Henry, because you blanch at the question and then you just knock it out of the park. So you do a great I mean, unfolding for people what phenomenology is and personalism and so on in a succinct way. Thank you for that. I just want to ask you quickly, was there a reason why he specifically did not describe himself as a personalist? Was there an aversion to that, or was it just that he wasn't ready to be completely labeled, or what's your sense about that, or is that really uncertain?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, my take on it is that for one thing, it may be that personalism for Van Hildebrand was not not a fully developed philosophy, but maybe more of a kind of profound emphasis within a philosophy. And so to speak of personalism, for example, he speaks about anti-personalism an awful lot in the anti-Nazi writings. And so he clearly
Mm,
understood what it meant to speak of
right.
personalism and anti-personalism. So that's one thing. The other thing is that I think Van Hildebrand had a great aversion to labels. He thought
Mm,
that yeah, I think he thought that schools and labels and sort of all sorts of different traditions and alliances were in some sense, and maybe he even underestimated the importance of schools of thought. But he for him philosophy was so oriented to the question of what is true,
mm,
that that I think the use of labels was, in fact, as far as I understand, he didn't even particularly like describing himself as a phenomenologist. I think he saw
Sure.
himself as doing phenomenology as a philosopher. In other words, he wanted to do really robust thinking about issues and not just sort of commentary and layers of commentary, but this sort of attribution of different schools and labels to himself. I think that was just basically foreign to his mode of operating as a philosopher.
It's interesting because it sounds like, an honest take in an age of a lot of ideological bright lines that I could see where a person would say, as soon as I had subscribed to, and I'm not trying to project, but the way I kind of think about this as I hear this is I want the freedom to pursue the truth where the truth takes me, as opposed to being boxed in to, I'm in this camp and therefore I must subscribe and defend to this. Whereas I might naturally kind of sort of fall out of feeling this way in this school and move on to that school. And I think people sometimes underestimate, at least I know this is the schools of philosophy, not necessarily schools of politics, but the ideological, oppressiveness of the day. It's a great answer to me that you offer, that he wanted to follow truth where truth was, and didn't necessarily need to have a stamp on his forehead saying I'm of this branch of the truth, so to speak. So it's fascinating.
I think that's absolutely right. And his wife used to say, I think she attributed it to him, but it was something she frequently said. She would say, "The question is never who said it, but is it true of a statement."
Good one.
And so that was the sort of basic spirit of Van Hildebrand. And I think one other point that one could bring in is that I think as a result of this, this commitment to truth and the pursuit of it wherever it led, he also had a certain antipathy for system building. Sort of
Yeah.
philosophical systems that tried to explain everything. He had a sort of basic suspicion of. Now, of course, he believed in certain fundamental universal principles. I mean, it wasn't as if he didn't think that there were truths that like for example, the principle of contradiction, is not something he would have denied because he was anti-systemic. But people, anytime there was a philosopher who wanted to have a theory of everything,
Yeah.
he had a certain basic suspicion because he thought, well, maybe we haven't investigated fully,
Yeah.
and yet here we are committing ourselves, to something for its systematic supposed benefits.
Yeah, the notion I think it was Chesterton that said, the person that wants to effectively obliterates all mystery will end up losing lucidity. But if he allows one thing to be mysterious, he gains greater lucidity. And it seems like von Hildebrand, I paraphrase that obviously, but it seems like von Hildebrand had a true embrace of that there are unknowns, there are uncertainties, and there are mysteries out there, because human beings will never fully comprehend or apprehend the entirety of it all. And so we should enter this effort to find truth and seek truth and understand truth with a great degree of humility.
That's exactly right, and I would say that Hildebrand's great emphasis on reverence, reverence for being, reverence for great values, reverence for truth, captures in a way this sort of basic posture of wonder and reverence before the world as it presents itself. And so, as a result of that, a great hesitation maybe um, to try to sort of capture everything um, uh, in in systematic terms or perhaps even reductive terms. Again, but Hildebrand went where the truth led him, and so he had many commitments that I think today people would say, well, this represents a kind of systematic commitment, or this is what it looks like to explore the world of values in a systematic way. But it was always. I like what you say about mystery and wonder and this theme of reverence. And in fact, Hildebrand says reverence is the mother of all the virtues because it creates this posture in which the other virtues can flower and flourish.
In 1914, John Henry, Hildebrand and his wife, Gretchen, converted to Catholicism. And he had said, it was not faith that determined my fundamental philosophical orientation. Rather, it was my philosophical orientation that leveled the path for my reception into the Catholic Church. Can you say a word or two, or several, about how philosophy, and maybe you've alluded to this already, how philosophy in part did lead Dietrich von Hildebrand to the Catholic faith?
Yeah, I think that's such an important comment that he makes about himself. It's in a sort of autobiographical thing he wrote late in life about his thought, and he describes the role of philosophy in his conversion. And I think it captures the way in which even though as all of us, when we make an act of faith, um, take a leap into the unknown, we also do it with varying degrees um, of clear knowledge about the world. And so, but for Van Hildebrand, philosophy, reason, was foundational, and I think it cleared the way in various ways. I mean, for one thing, it certainly cleared the way for a deep commitment to truth in the first place, and it cleared the way of things like relativism. There was a certain relativism in his upbringing, as we alluded at the beginning. Of It was a sort of kind of humane relativism, where we just we didn't we didn't have we avoid strong opinions about these things, where everyone should just a kind of live and let live philosophy, I suppose you could say, that he was steeped in. And so relativism was certainly cleared away, and various sort of obstacles of that nature. I think also the idea of a I mean, these are things that are maybe more common simply with the Christian tradition, but this recognition of um, the ordered world in which we live, the knowability of things, all of these things enter uh, uh, a significant. They all have a significant place in Hildebrand as a thinker. Um, Yeah, I mean, I could go on, but I think in one sense, I think it's fairly straightforward.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
really the idea that the sort of obstacles to truth that so often plague us were cleared away for Van Hildebrand by his philosophical commitments. And then I think I think the other thing is that he had a strong sense of the ability of reason so on the one hand, great mystery. On the other hand, reason can understand supernatural realities in important ways. So, for example, when he wrote his book In Defense of Purity, he thought very sincerely that purity is a supernatural virtue, that it's not simply something humanly attainable. So, grace plays a role, an operative role in purity. But he also thought that as a philosopher, he could investigate the nature of purity. And so in that respect, there's not a kind of apophatic sort of, well, we don't really know in the end, or there's so much mystery, it's impenetrable. There
Yes, yes.
remained this sense that no, we can understand in very deep ways, while being moved by the mystery of something like purity. We can also understand the nature of purity and plumb the depths of it in a philosophically serious way. And so you might say that um, anyways, I don't want to overinterpret what he says, but to sort of provide a larger context for that statement of his. Um, and I think finally it simply remains the fact that in fact he would sometimes say, when people would write in bios of him that he was a theologian, he would say, no, I'm not a theologian, I'm a philosopher through and through. That's my life's vocation. And so he was very clear about so what he saw as his primary role, even though of course he was a deeply believing Catholic, and had many profound commitments as a Catholic and as a person of faith. So those are some of the ways I think that those speak to and perhaps over address the question that you ask.
No, no. It's funny because it reminds me in a little ways. When Chesterton was not a Catholic and was sort of a kind of golden rule Anglican, I think, in his family, and kind of effectively analyzed the philosophies of the day and found them wanting, wrote heretics with dissent of various thinkers' ideas, philosophical ideas, and then was kind of challenged. Well, okay, you say what you're against. What are you for? And he finds himself feeling like, well, I learned all these different worldviews out there. I disagree with this, and this. And I've kind of backed my way into what I think is my own philosophy, only to realize that the Catholic Church had arrived there 1,800 years before I did. And not to say that that's the same path with Hildebrand, but I think as a Catholic convert myself, one of the things that has amazed me was how much notwithstanding the incredible mystery and supernatural aspect, revelation that is still overwhelming to me, when it comes to reasonableness and an understanding of the human nature and the way we think and we operate and our impulses and so on and so forth, it's amazing that you could be separated from the Catholic faith, draw a lot of great conclusions, and realize, well, the Catholic faith has been there all this time saying this. And so it strikes me as completely sort of Chestertonian, that the philosophy that the sense of reverence and holiness that von Hildebrand had as a child, and the philosophical insights he gained as he moved his way into his younger years, into his 20s and so on, would ultimately arrive at saying, well, the Catholic Church has been there the whole time. The whole time. And I'm not saying it's the same kind of conversion, but boy, it sounds, there's a certain amount of satisfaction in saying, gosh, what you can find on your own, plus obviously what God is gracefully dropping in front of you, is extraordinary. How it can make the Catholic faith show its truth to you, so to speak. I don't know if is that fair to say?
Yeah, yeah, it's very fair to say, and it prompts various thoughts. One of which is that for Van Hildebrand, the he often spoke of philosophy as a kind of making explicit of things that are already known, and so rather than the idea that, I mean, obviously philosophy can make arguments, and he made arguments and tried to defend certain theses. There's also this respect in which it's a kind of making explicit of things that are partially known, or perhaps given within the context of say the Catholic faith that he received, and so and he often described how um, his faith, his active faith, his allegiance to the church's teaching, had this kind of effect of profound insight, sudden insight, being flooded by insight, that came, you might say, on the other side of that prior active faith. So, for example, when he was told, in preparing for his marriage with his first wife, about the Catholic Church's prohibition on artificial birth control, at first his mind was somewhat repelled. He had a certain, kind of, he didn't see the problem, shall we say, with it, and he was quite clear on, other moral teachings. He had no difficulty, for example, with teachings on abortion and so on. He thought, but in the case of abortion, of birth control, he couldn't quite figure out who was being harmed. Who's the victim here, to use sort of more contemporary language. But the priest said to him, either you accept it or I won't baptize you. Imagine a priest like I like that. And so Van Hildebrand uh, chose to accept this in faith. And he describes how soon after that he was flooded with insight into the nature of conjugal love, the nature of sexual union, the superabundance that gives the superabundant relationship between the unitive dimension of sexuality and the procreative dimension. So all of this he attributed, though, to this willingness to make a prior act of faith. So, there's this fascinating relationship between faith and reason, even in, you might say, the most philosophically intensive people like Van Hildebrand, um,
Mm.
that is worth sort of stressing, as well as we talk about the role of reason in the life of this extraordinary man of faith.
But by the way, what a great lesson for those people out there who are wrestling with certain teachings of the Catholic faith, and to have a person like Dietrich von Hildebrand wrestle with this and ultimately becomes an extraordinarily articulate proponent of, or defender of, or articulator of the philosophical roots behind, or even theological roots behind this in some of his great work. So again, God writes straight with crooked lines. So it's an extraordinary, it's a great anecdote and example. Becoming a spellbinding professor of philosophy at the University of Munich in the wake of World War One, John Henry, von Hildebrand was early to recognize the dangerous nationalist, racist, as well as communist ideologies that were emerging in Germany. Principled, persuasive, and outspoken, von Hildebrand moved his students. And one student recalled, as you've captured in My Battle Against Hitler, quote, Heidegger's melodies no longer had the power to seduce us, for our ears had become more discerning. Whoever understood von Hildebrand was saved, despite many factors at work. I think one can rightly say that history might have been quite different had there been more professors like him, close quote. John Henry, what made Dietrich von Hildebrand so prescient about some of these dangerous ideologies?
It's a wonderful statement, isn't it? I mean,
Oh,
remember when I first found it, I was so moved by the account of this student of his,
mm,
uh, Yeah, no, it's really it's the ultimate endorsement of what he was doing.
Right.
Um, well, the the word that always came to mind when I think of this and other anecdotes is this power to inoculate that von Hildebrand seems to have had. That in exposing the errors of um, Nazism and all of the adjacent ideologies that were sort of at work there, or of communism, totalitarianism, the various isms that he analyzes, that the effect was one of sort of seemingly permanent kind of intellectual clarification in the minds and imaginations of those students of his, um, and uh, you know how did he do that? Well, I think there are various things at work. One of the things that I'm sure plays an important role was that he was able to do this in a very fundamental way. In other words, that he did this as a philosopher is quite relevant to this inoculating effect. It wasn't just a kind of um, practical or political analysis of Nazism. There were, by the way, there were plenty of political opponents of Nazism at
Yeah.
the time, right, including communists. And the traditional enmity between far left and far right is something Hildebrand ran into all the time. And what distinguished his newspaper, his anti-Nazi newspaper, was that it was anti-Nazi, anti-communist. This was not, such a normal or common move at the time. But this ability to sort of go after Nazism in a fundamental way, or the totalitarianism, the atheism, the militarism, to sort of identify these kind of poisons, at their very core, was one way I think in which von Hildebrand was able to have this kind of inoculating effect on his students. I'm sure that well, the two other things come to mind. One other thing is that Van Hildebrand I think, had a sense of the kind of gestalt of evil that Nazism was. He spoke of the Antichrist raising his head, and so I think for people who were, because it was easy to be in the throes of the pageantry and the
Yeah.
aesthetics and the pomp of National Socialism and see it as a rebirth of German pride and honor and so on in the wake of World War I and the economic devastation of the period, and so um, to see with such clarity the evil um, in National Socialism and totalitarianism was surely also, I guess, that's closely related to sort of this philosophical as the way in which Hildebrand as philosopher was able to reject National Socialism. Another thing that's always struck me is that he had a good sense of what made National Socialism attractive. It wasn't just a kind of thundering against the evils of the Third Reich, but for example, he understood that people were yearning for community and participation and connection. And he understood that National Socialism was playing on that need, right? The strong sense of bondedness and connection. Um, but he was able to show, I think, in his writing, how Nazism was offering a kind of false surrogate for this. This wasn't real community. This was ultimately, more totalitarian society. Um, and so those are some of the respects in which I think Van Hildebrand was able to sort of get to people's minds and hearts in such a way that it really um, uh, captivated them and protected them. And then finally, I think Van Hildebrand was so, he wasn't. You could say, in one sense, perhaps he wasn't a typical philosopher, in that his heart was deeply in this anti-Nazi resistance. In other words, it wasn't an attempt to do a kind of very neutral and objective and
Right.
fine-tuned, kind of fair appraisal of National Socialism. No, this was an act of intellectual resistance and battle against what he saw as a terrible and looming and threatening evil for Germany, for the church, for the world, and I think that ardor that speaks out of the memoirs and the some of the anti-Nazi essays that are found in the My Battle Against Hitler book. The way in which they speak to us today, I believe that they spoke to at least some of his readers at the time. Now, of course, he didn't. Not everyone was as sympathetic and receptive as the student that you
Yeah,
began by quoting. I
yeah.
mean, there were many, many people who just didn't understand what Hildebrand saw in Nazism, and wasn't he just overreacting? There was a lot of that directed at him, but at least some people were deeply persuaded by what he had to say in his very, to me, extraordinarily moving and persuasive witness from all of those years ago.
We're going to talk more about this because I think you are putting your finger on the absolute central aspect of this life. And that is, not only was Dietrich von Hildebrand courageous, but he had a fundamental understanding of the core of what was true in the Catholic and humane sense, and what was utterly false and dangerous in the ideological sense, whether it be communism, whether it be National Socialism, and so on. But he also had an understanding of the tendencies of human nature to shade, to hedge, to rationalize, to excuse, to adopt, to make certain concessions, and so on. And that could be kind of the path and the road to perdition, so to speak. It's uncanny. This is the second time I've read this book. It's uncanny the way he perceived not only the truth as the truth is, juxtaposed against the falsehoods being promoted in glittering pageantry, as you mentioned, by National Socialism, but also he detected not only in others but in himself, when are we at risk for compromising and sliding down that slippery slope, and making a deal with the devil. So we're going to get more into that in a few minutes.
I would love to. Yeah, no, that you're absolutely right. I think that kind of that great psychological realism um, that he had was is an essential sort of piece of the puzzle. And there are many. How would I put it? I mean, I think that there the book has tremendous practical value too, because there's a lot of moral realism in this book, and we can talk about that in a minute. But yeah, I could not agree with you more that it's not just a sort of good versus evil analysis, but there's a lot of ability to understand what was going on in people, and particularly people motivated by fear or ambition, or all the different sort of human motivators at work. But these were things he was very clear sighted about.
Segment 2: On Hitler's Blacklist. In 1921, speaking at a peace conference in Paris, Dietrich von Hildebrand publicly condemned the German invasion of neutral Belgium as an atrocious crime. This created an uproar in the German press for, quote, violating the nationalist tenet of the Nazi orthodoxy, end quote. After this, Hildebrand's name was placed on Hitler's blacklist, marking him for execution shortly after Hitler's attempted coup in the 1923 Munich beer hall putsch. So, John Henry, Hildebrand was well ahead of the curve on the philosophical dangers of National Socialism. Tell us a little bit about the beer hall putsch and what happened to Dietrich von Hildebrand as the chaotic events were unfolding.
Yeah. Well, so you described first this event that took place, I think in 1921. He went to this peace conference in Paris, and he was very moved by the experience because this was an effort led by a Frenchman that he came to admire a great deal, um, who wanted very profoundly to contribute to the healing um, uh, between particularly Germany and France. And as you can see, Van Hildebrand's participation there and some of the comments that he made, um, met with you know a furious response back home, because, as you say, the Nazi nationalist tenant by that point was to accept no possible wrongdoing,
Yes.
and so so Van Hildebrand, we should say at this point, beginning in the late 19 teens, is living in Munich, where he's a young professor at the University of Munich, professor of philosophy of religion. And it, at that time, of course, I mean, this more or less aligns with the rise and development of the Nazi Party, or the Nazi movement, shall we say. And so it's quite striking to think that already in 1921, 22, 23, he was a known enemy
Yeah.
of that very nascent party for his public statements. And it's very interesting that those statements, again, you know, they were, I mean, they were certainly directed against the Nazi movement, But they were again in that fundamental mode of the philosophers we were describing before. You know, he attacked nationalism and militarism, um, and racism. Um, you know, all, you might say, the fundamental pillars of Nazism, but he attacked them in that philosophical way. And so it was a kind of extraordinarily um, uh, direct and unfiltered way of attacking the Nazis at the time. And so by the time the beer hall putsch had come along, because of the statements in Paris that he'd made, and because of his because he was already such a well-known critic, um, he attended an early morning mass, which is how he first found out about this putsch, from a friend of his, and he realized very quickly that he needed to flee Bavaria, and so he went into one of the neighboring German states, and then very quickly, the beer hall putsch dissolved, and Hitler was put in prison. And it seemed like this nightmare moment might be over, and of course, it wasn't. Um, but Von Hildebrand already in that very early moment, 10 years before Hitler came to power, is already a clear and open enemy of the Nazis.
So this was a time of pivotal decision for von Hildebrand, and so he starts to, as you've mentioned, he realizes, you know, this is a dangerous environment. The strains of the ideological strains of National Socialism, and nationalism in general are not dead just because Hitler's been put in prison. As a matter of fact, he gets a really cush prison sentence. He's sort of a local hero in Bavaria, you know, southern Germany, and starts to reintegrate into the political process. And I always say, when I'm teaching on Hitler in various venues, what Hitler couldn't achieve violently in 1923, he ultimately achieved legally in 1933, which is a very ominous notion of what democracy can sometimes, you know, with the pulling the levers and playing the game, you might end up with monsters and so on. But Hildebrand, as he's recognizing the lay of the land and the dangers that he may be in and his family may be in, it's not whether he would resist National Socialism, but to be where and how he would resist. Would he do it from within Germany? Would he do it outside of the Nazi orbits? What did von Hildebrand do, and how did he decide?
I think this is a very important question because so often when you read short biographies of von Hildebrand, there's a line in there that says, and in 1933, he fled Germany.
Yeah,
Uh, and it sort of implies, by the way, it implies something in one sense very impressive, right? He must have been a sufficiently known opponent of Hitler's to have to flee. But but what bothers me about it is it sort of implies that that there was a that there was not a choice at the root of this, and you already alluded to this. And this choice was was how and where best to conduct this resistance. But as he was discerning his future, you know, first of all, he's watching this process by which Hitler is getting closer and closer to legal uh, control of Germany. Right? The memoirs describe very dramatically the different votes in the Reichstag, and so he certainly hoped that perhaps, you know, at the end he wouldn't have to leave. But then Hitler comes to power, and then the first months of that, make very clear the kind of Germany that Hildebrand will be living in. But the core thing for him really was the question, was the issue that as a Catholic and as a philosopher, he felt that as a Catholic philosopher, he had a kind of obligation to public truth telling. In other words, even as a had he been perhaps a Catholic with a more private vocation or without an intellectual vocation, perhaps he could have stayed, and he recognized that others stayed. There was this so-called movement of the inner resistance that existed in literary circles where people stayed, and they made a kind of deep inner commitment to opposition and resistance. But von Hildebrand felt that the Catholic philosopher that he was, that brought a calling to public witness. And then he knew, of course, that he couldn't stay and it wouldn't be safe for his family, including his family members who continued to live in Germany after he left. So in March of 1933, he left Germany, and as far as he was concerned, it was the final departure. He describes very movingly in the memoirs, sort of walking through each room in the home that he'd inherited from his father, and saying goodbye to the memories and to the past that had lived there. And the first place he went was back to the home of his birth in Florence, which was then owned by his older sister. And he went there with a general commitment to resistance, but without knowing how to do it, what to do. And it was a very difficult time for him because he got there and people understood what he was doing, but he felt totally alone because life went on as normal. He describes in the memoirs sort of, like it was the people were more interested in the summer music festival that was coming to Florence and, the various social activities and yet he was consumed with deep fear and concern for Germany and Europe and the world. And So it was a very difficult time of sort of discernment. And then various people came along into his life, including a relative by marriage, and they began to plot with greater clarity what the resistance might look like. And so the idea was hatched to start an anti-Nazi, anti-communist journal in Vienna, which could gather the resistance, particularly the emigre resistance of Germans who'd come to Vienna, um, and also stand for an independent Austria against Germany, because the great threat at the time was this idea that Germany would invade Austria, which it later did then in the so-called Anschluss, in pursuit of this greater Germany. And von Hildebrand had this idea that Austria represented a kind of true Germany, or a true German cultural space over and against the Germany that was being Nazified, and of course claiming all of the great German figures and achievements for Nazi Germany. And so he spoke of the great German hour of Austria, for example, in one of his anti-Nazi pieces. But he still needed a sponsor, and so the question became, well, how are we going to do all of this? And he became aware that the young Chancellor of Austria, a certain Engelbert Dollfuss, was, at least at the time, the only head of European head of state, of course, of a very small Austria at this point, who had a principled platform that was anti-Nazi. All the other great powers were in various states of denial or unwillingness to sort of poke the bear or wishful thinking, and on and on. But von Hildebrand found in Dollfuss someone who was prepared uh, to take this stance, and so he went to Dollfuss and he said, "I want to be an intellectual officer in the battle against National Socialism." And Dollfuss was impressed, and he agreed to sponsor this newspaper, or this journal that von Hildebrand began. And initially things were going well because he had a sponsor. He was sort of resettling in Austria. He was finding a circle of friends, and then again, I don't want to get ahead of ourselves, but then as you already know, things became ever more difficult for von Hildebrand, even in Vienna, and they became more and more dangerous for him as his opposition became more and more well known. But anyways, that's where Hildebrand went after departing Germany, with this strong emphasis here on the idea that he didn't flee. He went, and I see it in some sense as going into voluntary exile to conduct a work of resistance. I think that might in some ways be more accurate, even though it is certainly true that he couldn't have done this work in Germany. He would have been arrested and put into the concentration camp immediately had he attempted to do this. But it's not quite the same thing as a flight or an
No,
escape.
this is so important. And I think what's interesting to me is people in reading this book and becoming familiar through the work of the Hildebrand Project and our conversations and so on, the profound amount of sacrifice that von Hildebrand experienced, um, and at the same time, he could have sort of, again, hedged, excused, made small concessions. He could have been a celebrated, of course, he ultimately acknowledged a Jewish ancestry, and I think that was in partly sticking it right in the eyes of the Nazis. He was dismissed from the university, but he could have hedged and found a way to kind of work with them and so on and so forth. He could have been a celebrated university professor. He could have lived in the home that he's loved. He could have lived in Germany where he loves. He could have been surrounded by his family and friends. He could have been a person that wasn't going to be considered a pariah among people who were going along to getting along, much less ardent Nazis and so on. He could have found a way to make his life way more comfortable. And in his fidelity to the truth, he just simply could not do that. His conscience simply would not allow for that. And I think that the whole notion, as I read this, because there's the people that stayed in the kind of like you said, there's a certain illusion that, well, yes, you objected to Hitler, but you didn't stay and end up in a concentration camp like this person, that person, and so on, who are all, there's all many saints and heroes that went that route. But I think we also have to understand that there was a as you have said, there was a discernment process about where could he best fight this battle, and there was this notion of someone needs to articulate the intellectual, philosophical, and even theological defense, if not offense, against what the National Socialists operate. So, in the midst of the profound sacrifices he made, which I think cannot be overestimated, he lost so much. He found, I think, his spirit of resistance in being, like you said, the public voice. If he would have stayed, could he have been arrested, brought to a camp, and executed within a week? Absolutely. And we wouldn't be talking about Dietrich von Hildebrand as much because we might not know him, so to speak. So I just think that his particular role in and the way that he did it was profoundly principled, but also there's an incredible amount of efficacy in giving that intellectual, philosophical, and theological defense against National Socialism. Is that a fair way of saying this?
Oh yeah, yeah. I think it's a very very fair way of saying this. And something else that that I've always found so moving in the memoirs, in the pages that describe sort of the decision, well, the lead up to the decision to leave Germany, and then the sort of the period of departure and the farewells, is how the inspiration he always took from the words of Abraham: God will provide, Deus probe David. And
Mm,
he this was among people who knew Van Hildebrand. Apparently, this was a phrase that he so often turned to, but I think he lived it in a very profound way. And I would say that when I was working on the translation of the memoirs, I think I began the work with the assumption that this was principally a kind of work of moral courage and intellectual clarity and resistance. But I think when I look back on it now, it's much more clear to me what a profound act of faith this
mm,
also entailed, and not just a faith in the fact that God is who He says He is, and the church, and the truthfulness of what the church teaches, and so on, but a personal faith that God would provide and protect Van Hildebrand, maybe not even spare his life, but protect him in the deepest and most fundamental way. And so Van Hildebrand describes, for example, at one point being warned by the chief of the secret police. You may remember this passage. It's a rather humorous passage because the chief of the secret police did it in a somewhat, kind of indirect way. And he said, well, do you ever receive, people you don't know in your apartment, refugees? And you're, oh, well, of course I receive them. I want to help. Well, you can't do that. They may be assassins. And do you ever get in a taxi with someone you don't know? Well, you can't do that. And
yeah,
do you have your name on the door of your apartment? Well, you can't do that. And then the chief of the police says to him, they may not ultimately need to kill you. They may consider it sufficient to be able to put your eyes out. In other words, to somehow damage you. And Van Hildebrand says his words made, understandably, quite an impression on my wife, who was, who did not have maybe his particular kind of, makeup. But he said, they did not, he said, they made a certain impression on me, but they did not fill me with fear, because I was so
yes,
sure that I was doing what God was asking of me, and that He would
yes,
provide and
yes,
protect me. So I think that the not that people sort of doubt that element, but it's easy to sort of, to see in Van Hildebrand this, you sort of be moved by the heroic man.
yeah,
And certainly all of that is there. And I want people who encounter him to sense that heroic man that he was, but the heroic man of faith, the man who makes this extraordinary step in faith, that aspect, if you don't see that, you almost don't see the most important thing, the thing that sustained him and allowed him to be able to do this work that he did.
Hi, I'm Todd Warner, managing editor of Evangelization and Culture, the journal of the Word on Fire Institute. Word on Fire is a global evangelical community that exists to provide our members with the resources they need to proclaim Christ to a secular culture. Our award-winning quarterly journal, Evangelization and Culture, is offered exclusively to Word on Fire Institute members. It's a tangible representation of our mission and goal to lead with beauty in order to bring others to the knowledge of truth. Inside each issue, you'll find writing from premier scholars and inspiring pieces on literature, culture, and daily life from fellow missionaries on the journey to know and serve Christ. Get a copy of the current issue of the Evangelization and Culture Journal for free by visiting wordonfire.org/journal. Thank you, and join us in bringing Christ to a hungry culture. Segment 3, Sensus Supernaturalis. We spoke about the wonderful resistance, Dietrich von Hildebrand recalled, by Austrian Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss's government, about the awakening of Austria and the possibility of doing intellectual battle from there against National Socialism. We discussed the necessity of providing philosophical support for the resistance of Dollfuss, which we so welcomed, and of the possibility of offering our services to Dollfuss as intellectual officers in this battle. So, John Henry, you mentioned a little bit about Austrian Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss, and I'll honestly say, in reading this again, I have just such a great degree of admiration for Dollfuss's principles and his willingness to his insights into who von Hildebrand is, and the need for someone like that in his camp to provide this intellectual defense and offense and so on. Would there be any other things you would say about Chancellor Dollfuss before I move on to the next question of von Hildebrand's sense of the way people in the milieu in which he was operating rationalized and made excuses and so on? I want to just give you one more chance if there is anything else you want to say about Dollfuss and who Dollfuss was to von Hildebrand.
Yeah, well, I mean, we don't have to maybe speak extensively about Dollfuss. He's a fascinating figure, a very controversial figure for reasons that we perhaps don't have time to get into here. Um, but Dollfuss, I think Von Hildebrand saw in Dollfuss a kind of David willing to fight the Goliath of Nazism, and I think he was immensely attracted to a kind of simplicity and humility of character that he saw in Dollfuss. He didn't see in Dollfuss the ambitious politician seeking power. In fact, Dollfuss says at one point that he only wanted to remain in power long enough to avert the Nazi threat, and did not have aspirations for a very long-term political role. And part of the controversy associated with Dollfuss was his use of the military to suppress a revolt from workers from the Social Democrat side, which would have been the more left-leaning political party of the time. And today it's referred to as the Austrian Civil War, and many people died, and it is perhaps a stain on his character. But
Sure.
Hildebrand took a more sort of feisty defensive view of Dollfuss at the time. I think he felt that Dollfuss was somehow forced to take sort of more extreme measures given the extraordinary circumstances. But certainly, if you bring up Dollfuss in more secular context, he has this association with the suppression of the workers. But for Von Hildebrand, Dollfuss was quite simply a person with the clarity and the courage and willingness to resist National Socialism, and to do it at great personal sacrifice. And um, Dollfuss ultimately paid the ultimate price. He was assassinated soon after his collaboration with von Hildebrand began, by a group of Austrians, but who dressed as Nazis, and who were most likely acting in some coordination with the Nazi party, or the Nazi government in Germany. Again, it's a complex topic,
Yeah.
historical topic. But for Von Hildebrand, this was sort of a great blow, because Dollfuss represented not only the material support for the journal, but really the only hope for a solid Austrian resistance. And the Austrian leadership that followed took a much more passive approach toward trying to um, um, sort of accommodate and sort of try to keep Hitler sort of at bay. And it didn't ultimately work, obviously. But So that's just a little bit more on the
Yeah.
figure of Dollfuss. And in fact, when Dollfuss was murdered, Hildebrand, this is sort of classic Hildebrand, sat down and wrote a book, a kind of sort of biographical, and probably a somewhat hagiographical book
Mhm,
to
mhm.
sort of establish Dollfuss and his character and his heroism at a sort of a key moment in Austrian history. It's a very it's one of the books that's maybe most difficult, um, to we haven't, ourselves republished it, it would require so much sort of historical context for it to
Sure.
be well and correctly understood. I remember years ago sitting with I think it was Cardinal Schönborn, but it may have been someone else, who said to me, "One of the most difficult things you'll find to rehabilitating Hildebrand's legacy in Austria will be his connection to Dollfuss, because in
Wow.
Austria, this piece of Austrian history, the Austrian Civil War, is still a much more
Hot topic.
painful and complex topic. Although, as the years pass, I think it's ever more possible to have these kinds of conversations in the Austrian context. But if you think about it, even when Hildebrand's anti-Nazi papers came out in 1993 in German for the first time, they were they were. I mean, there was still plenty of living memory of that period, right? So it was a
Mm,
very
mm,
difficult book to come out. Even now, 30 and 40 years later, it's a different moment, a different opportunity to return to some of these painful, difficult chapters in German and Austrian history.
all right.
But I digress. This is perhaps
No, no. No, this is very good. John Henry, I want to explore von Hildebrand's keen ability to sense and refute rationalizations and equivocations made by many reasonable people about National Socialism, whether out of self interest or wishful thinking. In the eyes of von Hildebrand, to look at National Socialism in part and to establish a modus vivendi, some form of coexistence, is to deal with the devil. It will always drag you into the abyss of excusing totalitarianism, anti Semitism, and anti Catholicism. What was it like for von Hildebrand to see certain bishops and priests, academics, and politicians, many of whom were his friends, searching for Nazi virtue while excusing Nazi vice?
mm, he was quite simply he was dismayed,
Mm,
and deeply pained by what he thought was um, at the very least a terrible inability to see clearly the nature of National Socialism.
yeah,
As we said earlier in our conversation, Hildebrand was very psychologically astute, and so I think he certainly would have said that there were different, varying degrees of culpability, for example, in people's rationalizations of National Socialism. For example, he speaks of a number of his philosophical colleagues who ran a kind of, the Catholic Academic Association would have been. I don't know if there's really an equivalent in the states. I mean, we have our American Catholic Philosophical Association, but I
yeah,
want to say that at one point the Catholic Academic Association had over 10,000 members. I mean, it was an
mm,
immense organization. And so the head of this organization who built it up, and Van Hildebrand is very aware of the fact that this is his life's work, um, is at the same time trying to sort of build some rapport with Hitler, and with they invite this not chancellor, this ambassador von Papen, whom you mentioned at the beginning of our show, who was then not yet the Nazi ambassador to Austria, but later became the Nazi ambassador, where Hildebrand and he had their interactions. Um, but Hildebrand uh, speaks with a certain mercy of the kind of twisting and turning and sort of attempts to sort of protect the work of one of these leaders of the Catholic Academic Association. I think he had less sympathy for the bishops.
mm,
The bishops, he thought, had it was reasonable to expect that they should have the clarity to
yeah,
be able to see the incompatibility of Christianity and National Socialism.
yeah,
And so, for example, early on, there was a gathering of the bishops. I forget whether it was 34 or 35, maybe it was 33, but they gathered at one of their historic cities where the bishops would gather in Fulda, and issued this proclamation affirming all the good things that could be affirmed about
yeah,
National
yeah,
Socialism. I think this goes back to 1933. Um, and Van Hildebrand was just beside himself by the confusion, the lack of clarity, the lack of courage, um, and how this could only give ordinary Catholics the impression that it was possible to be a perfectly good Catholic
yeah.
and to be a member of the of to be a card carrying member of the National Socialist Party. So it's very interesting. If I may just sort of continue here,
Please, yeah, please.
one of the thing one of the places in the memoirs that is one of the episodes that has always moved me in a very very special way is this letter that Van Hildebrand wrote to his friends at Pentecost. in 1933, 34. Um, uh, and it's a letter in which he writes to, in fact, this letter does not exist because the friends who received it were so afraid to be found with it that it was immediately destroyed. I've always
Mm, mm,
wished
mm.
that a copy of it would still survive.
Right.
But in this letter, he explains to his friends, and this is why I said he had a certain understanding of people who did stay behind and recognized that not everyone was called to this public resistance. And he spoke to them about what he thought was the only way possible to remain in Nazi Germany, but preserve a certain fundamental integrity. And he says that one must always be prepared, one must always carry the dagger of irreconcilable enmity with National Socialism, ready to use it at any moment necessary without risking the concentration camp. In other words, there's not an obligation to come out and say something that will get you arrested. But on the other hand, this kind of sort of inner state of alertness and awakeness, so that as you are presented with evil or you are presented with some of the horrors that the Nazis were doing, that you didn't just sort of become accepting or inured to it, but that you in a way that you would sort of call it out for what it is. It reminds me a little bit of some of the topic discussions in moral theology where it said that, well, if you have to use this questionable vaccine, for example, as we're not sure how it relates to a fetal stem cell line, you should at least do something to express your principled opposition. You should write to the manufacturer.
Yeah.
Um, and take some kind of stance. And so for Von Hildebrand, he thought that it was extremely important that people sort of kept their moral being alive and alert in a moment like that. And so that was the purpose of this letter, to kind of keep this
It's
awake. And
incredible.
it's interesting that at least one of the anti-Nazi essays is called "The Danger of Becoming Morally Numb," and it picks
Mm,
up on that theme, right? What happens when you live, in an evil empire, and at some point you just get used to the horrors and the tragedies and the rivers of blood. How do you maintain a an inner rejection, um, and uh, and also how do you maintain an inner and lively connection to the good? It's not just a spirit of rejection. How do you continue to sort of nourish yourself? And so I think that's I mentioned before. There's a lot of practical wisdom in the
yeah.
memoirs, and I think this theme of sort of not just sort of coming to accept as kind of an unavoidable feature of reality the existence of evil, but to maintain a kind of alertness and rejection, all in a spirit of charity, of course, not
Yeah.
never becoming an unjust judge of those around you, recognizing the weakness of those around you, recognizing that you don't know necessarily all the factors that go into people's decisions. Um, but nonetheless, that to me is one of the perhaps one of the richest themes in Van Hildebrand's resistance, and one of the perhaps the richest things that he's given to us today. In our very distinct and unique circumstances that are not the same, even if they bear. I mean, we live in human history, so we will have
Yeah.
many of the same strands that challenge us today. But nonetheless, this theme of moral awakeness and moral alertness is a great gift of Van Hildebrand to us today.
I want to plug the book once again, which has been out for a while, but My Battle Against Hitler, because you also include, I think, 15 different, right? I think they were essays he wrote. I don't know if one or two might have been speeches as well of of very very pointed, very articulate, very philosophically inclined rebuttals against National Socialism, against ideology. Like you said, it's kind of the call to wake up, call to wake up, call to act, and so on. They're an extraordinary part, an extended appendix, if you will, of this book. The other thing I was going to say is you really remind me what you're describing here in this letter to his friends, a little bit of Václav Havel's Power of the Powerless. The notion that if you are the greengrocer behind the Iron Curtain, and you're supposed to have a sign in your window that says "Workers of the World Unite," um, perhaps even for you who might be crushed under oppression, and you're broken, but you know what's happening is wrong, and you still want to resist. Perhaps for you, even taking that sign out of the window, a subtle act of resistance to demonstrate fidelity to truth and so on. I think dissidents and saints and martyrs have had an extraordinary way of concentrating the truth about how does one reckon with our human nature to be fearful and to be self-satisfying and serving our own appetites against our call to duty, our call to conscience in the midst of horrible times. How do we do it? How do we reckon realistically with the tension towards safety versus the call towards faithfulness and so on? And as you have championed and have done such a wonderful job at this book, Dietrich von Hildebrand is an extraordinary model for how to make things work. So I think I appreciate again the work you've done.
It's
I
such a great book. It's hard to believe it's come out 10 years ago next year.
Yeah,
Uh, but it's had a wonderful run, and it continues to be read and discussed, and I'm so happy that we have a chance to revisit it here, because I mean it hasn't lost any of its relevance, its
not
timeliness.
at all.
Unfortunately, it seems to me that whenever we read this book, there will be
Yeah,
new relevances, or it will have new relevance, and it
yeah,
and it did when it was first published. And so, yeah, no, I think it's a very significant book. One other thing that always strikes me about Hildebrand's resistance is that there's certainly, I guess I'm sure there's an element of righteous anger in the book, but I really do struggle to find a lot of anger in the book.
yeah,
This is not a this is particularly when you consider all that he lost and risked, um, and the sacrifices that he made. You could imagine a recounting of all this. Remember, the memoirs were written in the 50s, so um, 20 20 and 30 years after the episodes described. And so he could have he would have had some bones to pick, maybe, or some, I don't know. I could just imagine a more um uh someone with more hardness and more anger.
yeah,
But
yeah,
what's in this book is really grief.
yeah,
uh Grief at the evil of Nazism, grief at the confusion of his fellow Catholics, and the poor leadership of many of the bishops, not all, but many of the bishops and clergy. um, and I think that's important to us today, because it is very easy to become angry.
yeah.
um, and we live in a culture of such anger and political anger, and Van Hildebrand is to me a wonderful example of someone who didn't capsize into anger.
No, no. To understand von Hildebrand's courage and sacrifice is to comprehend not only what he was against, but what he was for. And Hildebrand wrote books on philosophy and ethics, purity and aesthetics. He recognized the dangers of championing godless collectivism and a soulless reductionism of what it means to be human. A priest once asked von Hildebrand, "Do you know that God has granted you a rare sensus supernaturalis, that is, a sense for the supernatural? And do you realize clearly the responsibility such a gift entails?" So, John Henry, tell us about von Hildebrand's. We've been talking about this whole time, but any other words you'd say about von Hildebrand's sensus supernaturalis, which when he received this compliment, my understanding was it was profoundly heartening to him to have this priest
Yes.
say this to him. What did this mean to him, and what is the responsibility that such a gift entails?
Yeah, yeah. Well, so given our conversation just now, it seems to me one way of thinking of this sense of supernaturalis is to link it to this extraordinary power to perceive truth, um, uh, and to sort of and to be unaffected by the climate, the milieu around him,
Hmm,
and uh, and with respect to the supernatural here, I think to have a sense of the to not sort of interpret, for example, the church. I think for Van Hildebrand was so deeply and fundamentally the bride of Christ,
yeah,
and he preserved a sense for that. And I think that's an extraordinary expression of that sense of supernaturalis. And again, I think this is why he was so grieved at times by the church's more human side,
yeah,
because those were the moments in which the church was betraying its divine um, identity and origin. Um, and I think that the sensus supernaturalis in Van Hildebrand simply means, I think, that he had an extraordinary sense of the presence of God and the presence of God's grace um, in the world, and particularly in the church, um, and uh, and that he was able to preserve that sort of despite particularly sort of depressing and difficult moments. I mean, I think you see that, for example, in his grief regarding uh, the the kind of banalization of the liturgy,
Yeah.
following the council. Without even getting into sort of the questions of Hildebrand's particular love of the Latin Mass, fundamentally, what he had a deep love of was the liturgy, the Holy Mass, uh, the presence of the Lord in the Eucharist, and anything that obscured that,
Yeah.
anything that diminished that in the name of whatever, um, you know, was you might say, was deeply at odds with Van Hildebrand's sense of supernaturalis. And so anyway, I mean, that's just, but it's one of these kind of very fundamental qualities about Hildebrand. It's not unrelated to the what I said before about the way in which reverence is this sort of basic posture with which he approaches the world. And of course, reverence for Van Hildebrand isn't only with respect to the to the supernatural. Reverence is for all before all great things. He thinks that one approaches great music and great literature and philosophy in a posture of reverence. In fact, he says at the beginning of his Aesthetics, he says that just as Aristotle says at the beginning of De Anima, let us begin anew. He says, in my Aesthetics, let us begin anew and clear away all the obstacles to understanding what beauty is. And then he goes on to say that beauty is one of those realities that one can only understand if one begins in a posture of reverence and love. So anyway, so there's a deep continuity between this kind of general posture of reverence that Van Hildebrand cultivated so deeply, and then you might say the heightened reverence that he had before the supernatural, and before Christ and his saints and the sacramental life of the church.
It sounds like forever Von Hildebrand will be the young boy genuflecting at the side chapel in the Duomo,
Yes.
having that eternal reverence. I think it's incredible,
Yeah. 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 It was
incredible.
so deeply, deeply uh, awake in him, and I've also marveled at how Van Hildebrand was able to sustain, the ardor of these commitments through his whole life.
Yeah.
You had the sense that there was no cooling off, no tapering off of, the particular intensity of his life of faith and his love of the Lord and his love of the saints, right to the bitter end. He maintained this. It was a real burning love that was alive in him, and that just strikes me as is also worth emulating. Not always easy, because
Yeah.
sometimes we get tired. It may not be that we're numb to evil, but we just get tired. But there's Von Hildebrand reminding us that we need to be stirring up love and ardor and gratitude, and everything in a deeply heartfelt manner. And that to me is again one of those very moving things. One of the ways in which he has accompanied me and encouraged me throughout my life is this. Uh, the fire in Van Hildebrand that is, to me at least, spreads quickly to me, um, because there's just something so uh, moving and uncommon.
So you lead into my last question for this segment, which is in 1940, von Hildebrand leaves Europe and comes to New York, where he would ultimately teach at Fordham University for nearly 2 decades. Just could you say a few words on what became of Dietrich von Hildebrand in the years after the war until his death? I know it's like, tell me this remaining life biography, but what did he, like you said, he kept the ardor alive. He educated a generation out of Fordham in these principles of philosophy that are rooted not only in great study but harrowing experience. Could you say a few words about that?
Yeah, well, so first of all, when he came to the States, it's interesting. He had two job offers. The one was at the New School, where he would have had colleagues like Hannah Arendt and others. It would have been a very different environment. And then the other was from Fordham, and I think without any hesitation, he selected Fordham because it was his desire to be in a Catholic intellectual environment, and and at the time in particular, Fordham offered that, and so he as you mentioned spent about 20 years there. I've always said that I think that the first decade of Hildebrand's life in the States, from 40 to 50, is is really fast. Someone needs to go write a dissertation because it's in
Mm.
a way the least known, it's the least researched. It's the period before um, his marriage with Alice von Hildebrand, and Alice von Hildebrand became sort of the great documenter and uh, collector of all things related to her husband's life, and so we're in her debt that so much of this is preserved. But from 1940 on, there's a big gap, and there was a lot of political activity related to what he was doing in Vienna that continued in New York. So there was a whole emigre population there of Germans and Austrians who were continued to be concerned about the future of Germany and Austria, and there were people. In fact, I know an old Alice von Hildebrand's oldest friend. I mean, they were friends for I think almost 80 years. Met von Hildebrand for the first time at a commemoration of the Anschluss in 1942 or 43, 44. And the Anschluss is the German invasion of Austria. And the
Right.
speakers were Dietrich von Hildebrand, I think Felix or Otto von Habsburg, and Sigrid Undset, the
Oh my
novelist.
gosh.
So you could just imagine this fascinating universe of characters that he
Oh
would have been
my.
interacting with. And his attention turned in a particular way not to Nazism at that point, but to communism, which he saw in a way then after the destruction of National Socialism as sort of the new and more potent totalitarian threat. But anyway, so much of that is sort of like it's buried in letters, and we've got all sorts of files. For example, we have an article written by Hildebrand, which I think is pretty it expresses some typical views at the time, but it was sort of an argument. The article was basically a description of how should Germany be divided up after the war and attached to neighboring countries so that it can't remilitarize. So parts went to France, parts went to Austria, and so to think that he was thinking in those kinds of concrete political world historical terms. There were efforts to create a kind of sort of society of leading Catholics in America, interestingly enough, to protect against anti-Catholicism, which was
Mm.
perceived at the time as a really significant threat to Catholics.
Wow.
So there's all this stuff which sort of exists in enticing uh, documents and notes and memoranda. So someone's got to go do that. So that's part of my answer is that I hope someone hears this and decides I want to go write that dissertation because it's clearly important and fascinating. And we at the Hildebrand Project have lots and lots of documents and the like, so we're happy to put those at the disposal of anyone who wants to write that
So
book.
any
Um,
graduate students to call us out. John Henry Hildebrand has thrown down the gauntlet for anybody who wants to lift it up. I was going to nominate you, John Henry, but I think your plate's pretty full, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, yeah, and who knows? Maybe it'll just grow out of some of the other stuff that I'm doing. But it's an important point, that there's just a lot more known about his life from the late 40s on. So that's one thing, and of course during this period, Van Hildebrand taught very actively at Ford and became a very engaged member of the Catholic academic community here in the States. You can see his name on all sorts of conference programs and lectures, and he spoke all over the place. Then in the and he wrote a number of important books in English at that time. So books like
Mm.
What is Philosophy and Ethics and The New Tower of Babel. These were books that were written in the 50s and published then, and they were written with the help of various people. They're not always the best English, but they were written in English. Then comes an interesting period in which, and by the way, he then started to write his memoirs, which were in German, and wrote 5,000 pages of memoirs.
Wow.
So that kept him busy. Then came the period of the 60s and the Council. And once again, somewhat like he did with during the Nazi period, but Hildebrand somewhat put on hold his philosophical work to write more polemical works, so works more in the vein of a Catholic addressing fellow Catholics, not only fellow academic Catholics. And these include books like The Trojan Horse and The City of God, which was published in 1967, in which the Hildebrand Project will be republishing this year. And I'm happy to share, I think you know this already, with a forward from Bishop Barron.
Yes,
Um,
yes.
which I think is very important for situating this book um, historically in an appropriate way. And then there are other books that Hildebrand wrote at that period, many essays and articles. Um, and I think the best way to look at them is that they amount to a deeply formed Catholic layman laying down principles for how to live as a faithful Catholic during a time of immense cultural upheaval, intellectual confusion, certainly upheaval in the church. And so, somewhat like these anti-Nazi essays, there's a strong practical element. There's a handbook for sort of living during difficult times in the church, which seems to me pretty much a constant. And so, this book will be, I think, again, very important today. Then, after that period, I don't want to say it died down, but he made his contributions. He wrote extensively at the time. He returned to his philosophical work, but at the end of his life, he did it in German. And this is what created the need for the
Mm,
Hildebrand Project, because he wrote a 2-volume Aesthetics. He wrote his Nature of Love, which he thought of as his most important philosophical work. He wrote other works in ethics, many essays, and I don't actually know why he returned to the German. Um, uh, I mean, he would have known that these books would have to be translated, but it seems to me that he felt um, that certainly he thought that German was his native language and that he was
yeah.
more effective as a communicator. So in a way, I'm grateful that he wrote in his in the language in which he was most adept for these very important philosophical works. But it has definitely created a, a lot of work for the Hildebrand Project, and it's during these years that he formed many of the sort of now leading Hildebrand scholars. One of whom is my father, John Crosby, who met Van Hildebrand as a young student, a young undergraduate or I should say, he was a senior, but still a young man at Georgetown, and he invited Hildebrand to speak at Georgetown in 1968, and that changed the course of my father's life. And then he went on and studied under Hildebrand and Hildebrand students. So, in fact, this was after Hildebrand had retired from teaching at Fordham. So Hildebrand continued to form students, really to
Amazing.
the end of his days while writing these works. And he traveled and lectured a lot. There were lots of overseas tours. He would go to Europe more or less once a year in the summers. His sisters were still there and their children, and he would often spend the summer in San Francesco, which is the family villa in Florence, where also much writing um, took place. And then he had a number of cardiac issues. I think he had a couple of heart attacks, one of which I believe was in Mexico on
Mm,
a trip. And so, but he continued pretty much full tilt until he couldn't anymore. And then in his last years, he began to weaken. And then finally, in late 1976, he was clear that the end was coming. And then in January of 77, he finally passed away. Um, but in that very ardent Hildebrandian way, he said very beautiful things to his wife as he was dying. He said, for example, "I've always sought in my life to live according to the hierarchy of values."
oh,
In other words, I always sought to conform myself to the truth and to all the great values that are given in the world: moral values, aesthetic values, religious values. So that was, of course, very moving. He also said to her that if there was ever anything that was not completely in conformity with the teaching of the church, burn it,
wow.
of his work. So there
Wow.
was this readiness to discard anything if it
Yeah.
was found
Yeah.
not to be consistent with the church's teaching. And he died in an incredibly uh, grateful way. His wife describes how in the final days he asked to pray a Te Deum. It's one of the last things he was able to pray
Wow.
consciously. Um, and uh, yeah, yeah. And then there was a strong sense of, um, asking the Lord to take him. Take
Mm,
me, Lord, take me, Lord. And I've always been
mm,
very moved that on his tombstone, um, are the words of St. Peter, uh, "Lord, you know that I love you." And what I love about that is that Van Hildebrand had maybe a sort of a Petrine impetuosity, a full heartedness, a, um, uh, and so I've always sensed in those words not only a an expression of Lord, you know that I love you, but an
Yeah.
appeal to the Lord's mercy to say that despite my imperfection,
Yes.
you know that I love you. So
Incredible.
it's yeah, I mean, Van Hildebrand was um as you can see from our conversation, continues to move me deeply as a figure, and I find that he moves those who encounter him. And I'm so grateful, that you've encountered him and that Bishop Barron has been an extraordinary help to us as well. I mean, I don't know who's done more to champion him in the last 4 or 5 or 10 years maybe now than Bishop Barron.
Segment 4: The Hildebrand Project. I had to shed new light, Dietrich von Hildebrand reflected, on the absolute impossibility of any kind of compromise with National Socialism. For it is unbelievable how vulnerable our human nature is to falling into illusions and to growing numb in our indignation over injustice which we come to accept. Here, as in so many others in life, we must be like the conductor of an orchestra in continually renewing the call to alertness. The moment one lets up, people fall asleep or at least become indifferent. So, John Henry, in our remaining moments, just could you say a few words about what is the Hildebrand Project and how did this come about?
Yeah. Well, the Hildebrand Project is the institution that carries on the legacy of Dietrich von Hildebrand by publishing his work, which is a combination of translation from German into English and then also republishing and repackaging in new editions his works. And we have a kind of collected works underway of Hildebrand's body of writing. And I only say kind of collected works because it won't necessarily be, in fact, I know it won't be a complete works, at
Sure.
least in my lifetime, because it's just such a vast body of work. And it doesn't even touch things like correspondence and
Right,
notes
right.
and unfinished materials. But the publishing is the first and central thing that we do, and it's what called us into existence because when I founded the project back in 2004, this is our 20th year, if you can believe it. Um,
Wow.
the sort of the thing that felt urgent was the need for these translations, and so I
Mhm.
began making these translations with the help of Alice von Hildebrand, and it's really a story for another time. Some of the key things that worked out for us, I think maybe the most significant thing that happened was the involvement of Joseph Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, and the way in which he lent his support in critical ways. He joined as an honorary member of the organization. He wrote this extraordinary letter of support for us in 2007. Um, and soon after, I would say, almost in the first year of our existence, we realized that the it's not enough just to publish the work of a thinker like this, especially the philosophical work. There
Yeah.
needs to be a mechanism for engaging people around this, introducing people, mediating what it has to say. And of course, the Hildebrand Project is able to gather all of the leading Hildebrandians and other personalist figures to these events, our conferences and summer seminars and the like. And so we got into that business, I would say, within a couple of years of founding the Hildebrand Project. In 2010, for example, we had a big conference in Rome, which was, I think, the biggest Hildebrand conference ever held. And it was at the time of the publication of The Nature of Love. It was on that book. And then I think, lastly, I would say that we have, over the years, we have gone from thinking of ourselves just as organizing, events and programs to engage the work, to thinking also strategically about forming another generation of
Yep.
young scholars who will be formed by Hildebrand and bring him and his work into their work, and into their scholarship, so that his work continues to be engaged and developed. We're not. I, I've never thought that the goal is to create like mini Hildebrandians.
Sure. Sure.
That's too slavish. It's not really in the spirit of. We spoke earlier about Hildebrand's dislike of, like committing to a system in advance
Systems.
of
Yeah.
doing your thinking. Well, why would, in a way, a scholar shouldn't, just commit to a single thinker as much as they may admire him. And so we find that we get our best results when we get people who have multiple different centers of gravity. It
Mm.
could be a John Paul II and Hildebrand, or it could be a Cardinal Newman and a Hildebrand, or Shaler and Hildebrand, or sometimes it's a school like it might be a Thomistic personalism engagement. That's really the where we feel like we've really succeeded when we help to do that. And so we continue to gather all these people. That's a big theme of what we do in our events is we gather the growing community of people who've been deeply formed by Hildebrand and these other related thinkers like John Paul. And that is the mission of the Hildebrand Project. And in a certain sense, it's you might say it's unfulfillable because I mean there is endless material to be drawn out of Hildebrand's work. On the other hand, we're always very interested in, and I think this is just how the human mind works. You know, we when we engage a thinker who is trying to do sort of really addressing a timeless question in a timeless way, we still look for ways in which it speaks to us today, to our
Yeah.
particular challenges or particular moments. And so there's there's no shortcoming of ways in which Von Hildebrand's work speaks to all the different challenges and opportunities that present themselves to us today. And so that's the work of the Hildebrand Project in a nutshell. And as I said, we have our 20th anniversary this year, and we're spending a lot of time thinking about what does the short term and the long term future look like? How do we continue to make this? How do we continue to introduce Hildebrand in a powerful and potent way to those who can gain from him? And then, of course, we recognize the mysterious thing about great thinkers is that they affect people both directly and indirectly. They're people who don't quite know, they have a great teacher, for example, but that teacher
Mhm.
was deeply shaped by
Right.
Ivan Hildebrand. My dad at the end of his career has gotten many letters from former students over the years, and it's sort of a great encouragement looking back when you realize that someone who was in the classroom 30 years ago says, that book that you introduced us to, that author you
Yes.
first introduced us to, that changed my life. And so we take a lot of solace and hope from those kinds of somewhat unpredictable beneficiaries of the work that we're doing.
John Henry, two final questions. First, for those who are uninitiated in the works of Dietrich von Hildebrand, other than My Battle Against Hitler, which is a great biographical and work, also a sampling of many of his writings, where would you recommend they start? A book or two that you'd say, start with this.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think My Battle Against Hitler, especially for anyone who has who's historically inclined, it's a wonderful place to begin. You hear Hildebrand in his own voice, which is very
Yeah.
moving. Um, some people have many people have benefited by Alice von Hildebrand's biography, The Soul of a Lion,
Hmm.
which is based on those same memoirs that My Battle Against Hitler is about, but it's sort of Hildebrand's whole life from birth to death. So you get the story of his conversion, and you get somewhat a fuller picture than you do in My Battle Against Hitler. But it's told through a different voice, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Alice is a wonderful personality, but it's her story in a way. Uh, My Battle is Dietrich's story.
Yes.
I think that among some of his shorter books, The Art of Living is a particularly good place to begin. The very first chapter is on reverence, um, and it's not a long book, So for someone who wants to, and because each chapter is a different, it's an exploration of different virtues. It gives you a sampling of different aspects of Von Hildebrand's thought. Liturgy and Personality is another
Hmm.
relatively short book, and a much beloved book. And our edition has a foreword from Bishop Barron, which is a very good foreword. In fact, it's one of those forewords that actually will help you read the book better.
Good.
Not just nice words, but it's a good
Yeah.
introduction entry point into the book. So I have to recommend that as well. And I would say with people who make an attempt at the bigger, more philosophical works, just be patient with yourself. I think people sometimes. I remember someone years ago bought The Nature of Love and put it on their nightstand and sort of thought that they would read it, and it would be kind of like something to sort of improve their marriage, or help their children through relationship difficulties. And of course, it's a very fundamental work. It's not a book like that,
Right.
though someone who can read it in a deeply philosophical vein will probably say that it will deepen their
Helped in all those ways.
uh,
Yeah.
in all those ways. But I would just say sometimes people, I think, they become very excited because some of Hildebrand's books are more accessible, and then they find
Yeah.
that some are more demanding. So just be patient and sort of work your way to those books. Finally, Transformation in Christ is a very very beloved book. It's a book that is, it's not, I wouldn't say it's a particularly scholarly book, but kind of based on, I don't know, sort of today's readership. I think probably in Van Hildebrand's time it was sort of accessible to a larger public than it is today. So sometimes people will say, it's a difficult book. My recommendation with Transformation in Christ is just read it slowly.
Yeah,
It's the sort of book you can read over the course of a year and meditate on it sort of paragraph by paragraph. It lends itself to that. So that's a book that, for someone who's maybe wants to be a little bit more ambitious, Transformation in Christ. For someone who wants a good entry point, I'd say The Art of Living are
fantastic.
where people should begin.
And the nice thing, as you've mentioned, is that the Hildebrand Project is not only championing these books but reissuing them over time here. And the editions that I've gotten that you have recreated, translated, and so on they're beautiful. They're accessible. And yes, some of his works are more demanding than others. But boy, everything that comes forth from the pen of von Hildebrand is worth your time. John Henry, I want to ask you finally, in my last question, um, given your father's experience with Dietrich von Hildebrand, given your effectively now your life's work dedicated to the promulgation of his works, his lens through which he looked at things, and the gathering of people in this kind of strange ideological age we're living in, how have you personally been affected by the faith and thought of Dietrich von Hildebrand?
Well, for Van Hildebrand, for me, is first and foremost a witness to truth, um, and truth in a broad sense, both truth in the simple sense that we can know truth
Mm,
about the world and about ourselves, but also truth in a supernatural sense, a witness to the truth of the gospel, um, and and in that way, he has confirmed and strengthened me in ways that I can't imagine not being the beneficiary of. I mean, I don't know what my commitments or my sort of life's trajectory would look like, and I don't want to, sort of suggest that I'm only a believer because of Van Hildebrand.
right.
Though sometimes, in our individual stories, a particular thinker, a particular book has a powerful impact. But for me, I would say Van Hildebrand in this mode of the moving witness has been the person who is that's what's moved me most about him. And then I would say related to that are his works on broadly on beauty and aesthetics.
Mm,
This wonderful um, ability to speak, uh, to elevate to elevate in our vision what is in fact the case, the power and I don't even know all the words I would want to use to describe sort of the ways in which beauty transforms us. But
yeah, yeah,
Hildebrand is a wonderful uh, both a philosophical exponent of this, but there are many passages where he speaks more plainly and more immediately about the way, for example, the way in which he speaks about how the encounter with beauty makes the soul of the one who experiences the beauty beautiful, him or herself. There's a
mm,
kind of um, rubbing off that happens, or the way in which he speaks about the way in which beauty sort of breaks the spell of a kind of pragmatic hold that the world has on us
yes,
and makes us contemplative. Some of those themes in his work have been just absolutely central to my own development and I think I have to say that they're not just they've helped me see and experience the world in a different way. That's the key thing. It's not just that they're sort of compelling ideas that now when I want to give an answer, I say, well, Hildebrand has this to say, but
yeah, yeah,
it's actually had this orienting effect for me on the world. And I think we're all in the debt of von Hildebrand for that kind of making explicit. We talked about that before, how philosophy makes explicit things that are perhaps already known or felt. Um, but the way in which he draws out and showcases, um, you know, the beauty of of truth, the fact that truth is worth sacrificing for, um, all of those things that move the heart. Um, I'm those are the things that have most deeply shaped me in Van Hildebrand. And I have to say that, I mean, it's not that I go around, waxing poetic all the time, but it doesn't take me a lot as I sort of revisit Hildebrand to sort of to have all of this sort of renewed in me
Yeah.
in a very powerful way.
John Henry Crosby, philosopher, president, and founder of the Hildebrand Project. Thank you so much for talking with us. It's been a pleasure spending this time with you.
Todd, it's been a joy. Thank you for having me.
So I've been thinking, imagine yourself as a proud German in the late 1920s, early 1930s, broken physically by the devastating Great War, ruined financially by the Great Depression, and bereft emotionally by the great humiliation of national collapse. You hunger for recovery. Now imagine an electrifying leader emerges who taunts your enemies, stiffens your spine, and promises a restoration of honor, pride, and wealth for all proud Germans. Oh, this leader, the Fuhrer, can get carried away with his rhetoric. And yes, his diehard followers can rough up Jews, communists, and Catholics. But does it really matter if you reclaim what you have lost? Dietrich von Hildebrand would answer vehemently and unequivocally, yes, it does matter. In reading and rereading Dietrich von Hildebrand's memoir, My Battle Against Hitler, and talking with John Henry Crosby, I was struck by the precise and immutable mix of strengths required to defy evil in the way Dietrich von Hildebrand did, lest you fall into devastating error as the proud German did. First, you need courage. Dietrich von Hildebrand had the courage of his convictions. He found the ideology of National Socialism and its political, cultural, and spiritual implications so abhorrent that there could be no compromise. And so Hildebrand sacrificed everything: his home, his livelihood, his proximity to friends and family, and even his own safety. Better to be a beggar in freedom, Hildebrand would insist, than to be forced into compromise against my conscience. Next, you need an understanding of and fluency in your beliefs and principles. Raised in a nominally Protestant home, Hildebrand was initially unformed, but he was a lover of logic. And it was his logic that brought him to philosophy, and philosophy that brought him to the Catholic faith. In 1921, 12 years before Hitler would become chancellor and 2 years before his breakout beer hall putsch, Hildebrand would be named Hitler's enemy number one. Why is that? Because Hildebrand was well versed in the foundations of his Catholic faith and the tenets of sound philosophy. And that was a threat to Nazi ideology. In academic settings, Hildebrand intellectually dismantled arguments for a war fevered German nationalism and ultimately spiritually demolished the religious fervor for Hitler's National Socialism. To know what you are against, Hildebrand seemed to say, you must first know what you are for. Through prayer and study, discussion and debate, Dietrich von Hildebrand knew his first principles and how to offer a full throated defense of them. Finally, you need a fundamental and honest apprehension of human nature, most importantly, your own. To be sure, we are dignified children of God, but this doesn't immunize us against profound error. We are also fallen creatures, susceptible to our dark interests and selfish appetites. Hildebrand had a keen sense, without being a pugnacious scold, of our penchant for safety and pleasure secured through deal making, corner cutting, and unrepentant rationalization. Even good people, Hildebrand recognized, formed well in their faith and philosophy, risked being tipped over by fear, fatigue, and magical thinking. This demands an uncompromising clarity and alertness. As Hildebrand reminded, we must be like the conductor of an orchestra in continually renewing the call to alertness. The moment one lets up, people fall asleep or at least become indifferent. And Charles Pagoy would add, we must always tell what we see. Above all, and this is more difficult, we must always see what we see. This is what Dietrich von Hildebrand brought to his battle against Hitler: his stand against dark ideology, courage, conviction, and clarity. May we have the resolve to learn from him and do the same. And one last thing. After having this conversation with John Henry Crosby, it goes without saying that everyone should read Dietrich von Hildebrand's memoir, My Battle Against Hitler. But also be sure to check out the many works of Hildebrand reissued by the Hildebrand Project. These volumes explore everything from ethics to ideology, the liturgy to aesthetics. And please be sure to read our spring 2024 issue of Evangelization and Culture, where we publish Technology and Its Dangers, an essay from Dietrich von Hildebrand that is relevant to our troubled times. Thank you once again for joining me on the Evangelization and Culture Podcast. I'm Todd Warner, and until we meet again, keep bringing Christ to a hungry culture.